Welcome to the Sakimori Research Lab of Universal Spirit. Thank you very much for your visit. In der Vorige Folge 11 Wise Rudolf Steiner darauf hin, dass ein der Persönlichkeit im Alter von 30 Jahren erscheint, und im Fall von Onisaburo Deguchi sagte, dass wir 30-jährige Praktiken stattgefunden haben. Bestätigt dann, dass Susanoo Makoto im Alter von 30 Jahren und Maitreya im Alter von 56 Jahren herabkam. Regarding the Bodhisattva Maitreya's characteristic of never calling himself the Christ, Onisaburo Deguchi discussed how he strongly denied being referred to by his followers as the second coming of Christ. On the other hand, he considered that he was performing divine acts with the baptism of fire in mind by Kodadama. This time, although the content will leap a bit, I would like to verify the change in self-consciousness that we humans have traced from the era of the sinking of the Atlantis continent to modern times. Because, in that point as well, we can find a lot of common recognition between the two. Because, by recognizing the spiritual meaning of human history, it becomes clear why the Maitreya Bodhisattva of the Essenes prepared Jesus Christ in the 1st century BC. Also, by that, it is understandable why Maitreya Bodhisattva had to prepare for the appearance of Christ in the etheric world in the first half of the 20th century, and why it had to be accomplished. Let's get started right away. First, in his lecture The Appearance of Christ in the Etheric World, Rudolf Steiner refers to the period before the catastrophe of the Atlantis era as the Golden Age, stating, ancient times, when humans were in direct interaction with divine and soulful beings, are looked back upon by higher cognition. He then discusses the division of these eras. However, here, for ease of understanding, I think I will introduce each era separately, excerpted and divided by era. The era when humans were still one with divine and spiritual beings is called the Golden Age or Krita Yuga. This is mainly the era that passed before the catastrophe of Atlantis. In the next era, the connection with the divine and spiritual world was not felt as strongly as in the Krita Yuga. People no longer felt that their impulses were determined through communal life with the gods. People's gaze towards the spirit and soul had already darkened. However, people still retained memories of their communal life with spirits and gods. Indeed, people were still in the spiritual world. However, in this era, the certainty of that was no longer as strong as before. This is the Silver Age or Treta Yuga. In the era that followed, the human gaze towards the spiritual world was increasingly closed. Humans increasingly became beings of the external sensory world. As a result, humans were fixed in the sensory world. The inner ego, human consciousness, increasingly appeared. This era is called the Bronze Age or Dvapar Yuga. Humans still had remnants of the divine spiritual world as before. It's like when a person grows old, some of the joy of youth remains. Youth has passed, but you have experienced youth. You know about youth and can speak with conviction about youth. In that way, at that time, the soul trusted what would lead it to the spiritual world. That is the essence of Dvapar Yuga. Then, another era came. In that era, even the conviction towards the spiritual world was lost. It was an era when the window to the spiritual world was closed. The human gaze was increasingly limited to the external sensory world and the intellect that processes sensory impressions. Humans could only think about the spiritual world. This is the lowest method to know something about the spiritual world. What humans truly knew through their own experience was the sensory, material world. When humans wanted to know something about the spiritual world, they had to know through thought. In that era, humans became the most non-spiritual and were most restrained and bound to the sensory world. However, this was necessary to gradually develop self-consciousness to the highest heights. This is because humans can learn to distinguish themselves from the world and feel themselves as unique beings only through the coarse resistance of the outside world. We name this last era the Dark Age or Kali Yuga. As you can see, in Steiner's case, he explains it divided into 4 eras. Also, the word blank yuga used by Steiner here is said to be a word used in the cosmology of ancient India. However, in the thought of ancient India, it is said to be a unit of several 100,000 years, but in the case of Steiner, he says as follows. Please note that these expressions can be used for larger spacetime. For example, the name Kritayuga can be used for larger spacetime. Before the Golden Age, humans were involved in a higher world, and a more ancient era can be encompassed by the name Kritayuga. However, if you are satisfied with a small-scale recognition without looking over such a vast spacetime, you can divide it as I just mentioned. Also, regarding the sinking of Atlantis, if we compare Steiner's Anthroposophy and Edgar Cayce's reading, it is estimated to be from 8000 BC to around 7000 BC. However, regarding this Atlantis era, whether it is the duration of the continent's existence, the duration of civilization, or the name of the era division, the age to be shown varies greatly depending on this, so I think it would be good to verify this again on another occasion. The above knowledge is about the soul. It is therefore important to be aware that the composition and shape of the human body in Atlantis was very different from ours today. Next, Onisaburo Deguchi states the following about the ancient soul and consciousness of humanity. Originally, humans were given a good soul, but it gradually became worse. The Golden Age was originally a good soul, but as the world gradually deteriorated, it declined through the Silver Age, the Red Copper Age, and the Black Iron Age, and is now in the age of a sea of mud. Therefore, those born into this world have a mixture of external conditions in their souls, making them a mixture of good and evil. In other words, humanity has gradually corrupted its spirit and soul into material things, as expressed in the words of the Age of Gold, Silver, Red Copper, Iron and Mud Seas. Also, in the Tales of the Spiritual World, he speaks in more detail. The earliest human beings on earth were celestial men, and the natural objects they saw were merely imitations in their thinking. The ancient humans interacted and conversed with the heavenly people, and the harmony between the heavenly world and the world was achieved through them. This era is called the Golden Age. Next, the inhabitants of the heavenly world lived with the humans on earth and interacted with the humans like friends. However, at this time humans no longer thought according to the heavenly world, but acted according to their knowledge of the heavenly world. In addition, although the heavens and humans had reconciled, they were not as close as they had been in the past. This period is called the Silver Age. The heirs of this Silver Age knew the wisdom of the heavens, but their thoughts were no longer due to that wisdom. Therefore, the goodness and virtue they possessed was natural and they could not become spiritual like the people of previous ages. This is known as the Red Copper period. From this time onwards, man gradually became an external being and finally a physical being. As a result, the sensibilities corresponding to the heavenly world have completely fallen to the ground. All knowledge of the heavenly world has been lost and it has become increasingly difficult to learn many things about the spiritual world. Gold also represented a corresponding heavenly good, which was also the situation of early mankind. Silver also represented the good of the spiritual world and was the situation of people in mid-ancient times. Red copper represented the good of the natural world, the situation of people in late antiquity. Further down the road, the Black Iron Age emerged. Iron represents the cold truth, and it is an era where there is no goodness. In this light, the current era has completely fallen into the world of mud beyond the Black Iron Age, and has become a hell of darkness and ignorance, where both good and true have lost their shadows. As mentioned above, Onisaburo Deguchi divided it into 5 eras, and in the first half of the 20th century, it was the 5th era of darkness and ignorance that had become a mud sea era. Furthermore, Emanuel Swedenborg has already spoken about this. At one time, in the case of Swedenborg, he went to the spirit world called the Group of Star Clouds, where groups of super-ancient spirits that existed from the ancient times far beyond the era when the current human soul arose live. The central figure among them spoke of a scene where millions of spirits on the earth in the ancient times on the planet, by their own judgment, detached their souls from their bodies and entered the spirit world. He continued about the spirits of humans who foresaw the great flood on the earth, discarded their physical bodies, and returned to the spirit world. Then it was found that they were the ones who had died, their fields and houses washed away by the rebellion of the Nile River in Egypt. The spirits that first appeared in the spirit world were particularly those who had advanced spiritual enlightenment. Therefore, they were the ones who had a premonition of death by the flood, and detached their physical bodies to appear in the spirit world. He, the superancient spirit, continued this story, saying that there were Golden Age, Silver Age, and Bronze Age in the past in the relationship between the human world and the spirit world, and now it is the Iron Age. Things like those few spirits are not at all in recent times. This is because it has become the Iron Age. Of course, in the Golden Age, and even in the past Silver Age, such things were often done. I had never heard of the Golden Age, Silver Age, and so I had no idea what they meant, but he explained it as follows. In other words, in the past, especially when the ancient humans still had an honest heart, they accepted everything about the universe with an honest heart and lived accordingly. Because of this, the hearts of the ancient humans were much more open to the spirit world and spirits than the people of recent times. Simply put, the ancient people were leading a spiritual life. However, as time went on, human interest began to be taken over by more worldly things, material things, and what he called lower-level things such as external knowledge and learning, and as a result, they began to distance themselves from the spirit world. The relationship between the spirit world and humans was as close as it was in ancient times, but as time passed, it became distant, and now it is as if they have become completely separated. And humans are becoming unaware of even the existence of spirits and the spirit world. I call this the Golden Age in ancient times, followed by the Silver Age, then the Bronze Age, and now the Iron Age. This is understood from talking to the spirits who are newly entering the spirit world, as the level of spiritual awakening decreases as time goes down, and it takes extra time to advance their spiritual awakening. In this way, Emanuel Swedenborg also spoke about being taught about the spiritual ages of mankind by spirits older than the human soul. At the same time, it is said that our learning of spiritual wisdom on earth is extremely important for awakening in the spirit world and the progress of the spirit soul. Next, about the specific years of these eras, starting with the Dark Age from 3101 BC, Steiner also stated as follows. Just as the leap from green leaf to blossom takes place, clairvoyance can indicate exactly when it will stop. Of course, the process was slow, but on average, it stopped at a certain era. That point is 3,101 years before Christ. At that point, humans abandoned the ancient clairvoyance. Before that point, a vague spiritual vision existed, like a memory of older clairvoyance. Long ago, humans really clearly saw the divine spiritual world. At that time, humans saw material things as meaningless. That is the Golden Age. The next is the Silver Age, and humans could still see the divine spiritual world. Then comes the Bronze Age. In the Bronze Age, there were memories of ancient spiritual vision. And in 3101 BC, the next era, our era begins. In this era, the door to the divine spiritual world was closed. 3,000 years after the start of the Dark Age, the mystery of Golgotha occurs. Humanity could no longer ascend to the gods. Therefore, a single God had to descend to the earth. By the Christ event, God descended. Man's personal sense of self could live fully only in the Kali Yuga Dark Age. Therefore, the event of Golgotha had to occur there. So why did we humans lower our souls until we could no longer feel the divine spiritual world and become buried in the material dimension? Simply put, it is said to awaken the ego consciousness of the soul, which lies between the spirit, which is part of God, and creation, and promote the evolution of the spirit. In ancient times, the soul, which felt the divine spirit close to it as a part of God, was permeated by the divine spirit, so there was a collective consciousness like we, but it is said that it did not awaken a clear individual ego called I. However, when the soul was cut off from the divine spiritual world in the Dark Age, each of us individuals reached the stage of evolving the I as a self in consciousness. However, because humanity has sunk too deeply into the material world, the individual ego consciousness that sprouted in each individual could no longer return to the original world of the spirit. Therefore, the need arose to open the way to ascend spiritually again, and it is said that Christ incarnated in the body of Jesus. In this sense, when the human soul was at stake, Jesus Christ returned to the spirit world, leaving the gospel on earth and, through the mystery of Golgotha, demonstrated the immortality and eternity of the soul after physical death. Through his resurrection, he gave humanity a spiritual soul and literally became a savior. Steiner has also stated the following about this matter. The era in which John and Christ were active was a time when the Dark Ages had already begun, and 3,100 years had already passed. By that time, humans had lived through the Dark Ages at least once or twice. As individual consciousness intensified, memories of the spiritual world dissipated. Humans who did not want to completely lose their connection with the spiritual world had to learn to experience spiritual things within their individual selves. They had to develop their individual selves, and within their individual selves, they had to be able to at least believe that the spiritual world exists. Humans belong to the spiritual world. Higher spiritual beings exist. If someone had spoken the original truth of the time during the era of Jesus Christ, they could have said, once, humans could experience heaven outside of their individual selves, in the beyond of the spirit. When they left themselves, they reached the beyond of the spirit. Beyond the individual self, humans must have experienced the kingdoms of heaven. Now, humans cannot experience the kingdoms of heaven in that way. Now, humans have changed greatly. The individual self must experience the kingdoms of heaven within itself. The kingdoms of heaven have approached humans and have come to work within the individual self. John the Baptist said to the people, "The kingdoms of heaven have approached." Matthew 3. In other words, the kingdoms of heaven have approached the individual self. Once, the kingdoms of heaven were outside of humans. Nowadays, man must grasp the approaching kingdom of heaven in what is closest to him, his individual self. And in the Dark Ages equals Kali Yuga, humans could no longer go out from the sensory world to the spiritual world, so the divine being, Christ, had to descend to the material sensory world. This is why Christ had to descend into the human body, into Jesus of Nazareth. Through observing the life and actions of Christ on earth, humans were able to gain a connection with the kingdoms of heaven, the spiritual world. We humans, from the Golden Age before 8,000 to 7,000 years ago, when the sinking of the Atlantis continent occurred, through the Silver Age and Bronze Age after the sinking, reached the Dark Age Kali Yuga around the time we passed 3100 BC. One of the reasons was to awaken the individual ego, the I, of each human being. Also, at the same time, it was a descent of dimensions to ascend to the spiritual world while maintaining individual consciousness by building the spiritual world within one's own consciousness. However, as humans gradually lost their spiritual vision, Christ had to descend into the body of Jesus, otherwise, he could not return the human soul to the spiritual heaven, which was a critical situation. And 2,000 years ago, by the baptism of John, Christ, the solar spirit, descended into Jesus, and the guideline and model for mankind to ascend to the kingdom of God were shown. Also, the soul, which is the intermediary between the spiritual world and the material world, by understanding the spiritual laws through the gospel and acquiring love and wisdom in its own spirit, opened the possibility of encountering higher angelic beings while maintaining spiritual clairvoyance after death. However, even at the beginning of the 20th century, human souls were again facing a crisis due to materialism and religious dogma. And it is the view of Anthroposophy that Maitreya Bodhisattva had to be born to save mankind from this critical situation, live in the mold of Christ, and prepare for the second coming of Christ to the etheric world. And about this, in the case of Onisaburo Deguchi, he speaks using Japanese chronicles and mythological words as follows. All this universe is, the God of supreme goodness, supreme truth, and supreme love, created all things for a purpose, and in an appropriate order, made humans in the form of God. Moreover, since man descended to earth as the spiritual head of all things, in order to fully carry out God's work, man must uphold the order of the divine world, do good for the sake of good and truth for the sake of truth. Today, however, the golden age of the distant divine age has passed, and after the silver age, the red copper age and the black iron age, we are now in the chaotic age of the muddy sea. This is because God gave freedom to humans so that they could perform sufficient divine activities, but humans gradually turned against it, became captives of the eight-pronged serpent and false god, and eventually rebelled against God and even ignored the existence of God. Therefore, such a world of darkness and ignorance has emerged. However, as if things will be achieved when they are exhausted, the great God, who is supreme benevolence and supreme love and is equipped with infinite absolute power, will never overlook this. Therefore, the great God descended a prophet to the earth to greatly correct the three realms called the present ghost God, and was given a certain grace period. And during that time, it was planned to enlighten the love of God to humans who had become ignorant and evil, and to correct their arbitrary actions. Thinking about this, we humans must always polish our spirits, raise the path of repentance and improvement, and devote ourselves to the divine consideration of the great God of great mercy and great compassion. Here, Deguchi Onizaburo says, descended a prophet to the earth to greatly correct the three realms. He is probably referring to saints such as Buddha and Jesus. However, the reason why Onisaburo Deguchi speaks this way is because, just as the birth of Christ was prepared on earth 2,000 years ago, in the 20th century, he had a mission to bring God into the world. Also, that should have been the mission of Maitreya Bodhisattva to fulfill the second coming of Christ in the etheric world that Steiner had prophesied. In conclusion, in the 12th episode, we have briefly traced the spiritual history of the human soul from the Atlantis era to the present. Also, both Rudolf Steiner and Onisaburo Deguchi, as initiates, have been verifying that they have almost the same view about the golden, silver, bronze, and dark ages. At the same time, we deepened our understanding of why the human soul sank deeply into the material dimension and drifted away from the divine spiritual world, and also considered the reason why Jesus Christ was born on earth 2,000 years ago. In the next 13th episode, we plan to spiritually verify the spiritual crisis of the 20th century, when the earth became a world called darkness and mud sea because the human soul descended into the spiritual dimension. By doing so, we aim to deepen our understanding of the spiritual background that ended the Dark Age in 1899 and brought about a global war in the 20th century. Thank you very much for watching until the end. We look forward to your continued support.